It is mid-December 1944 in the Pacific Theater's final act. The newly commissioned Japanese aircraft carrier, Unryū, slips out of Kura Naval Base under cover of winter skies. She is bound for the embattled Philippines, carrying desperately needed reinforcements and weapons to a garrison on the brink. Escorted by 3 destroyers, Unryū cuts through the East China Sea, on what is both her maiden operational voyage and, unbeknownst to her crew, her final journey. As one of Japan's last remaining fleet carriers, Unryū represents a glimmer of hope for a navy in decline. Yet in these perilous waters stalk unseen predators. Within 2 days, the fate of Unryū will be sealed beneath the waves, marking the end of a carrier that barely tasted service. Unryū was the lead ship of a class of aircraft carriers conceived in urgency and shaped by circumstance. Her name means Cloud Dragon, echoing the tradition of auspicious creature names for Japanese carriers. She was ordered in 1941 as part of an emergency naval build-up following catastrophic losses at Midway. By that time, Japan's once formidable carrier fleet, the Kido Butai, had been gravely diminished. The Imperial Navy's answer was the Unryū-Class, a series of fleet carriers designed for rapid construction to replenish fleet strength. In concept, it was Japan's attempt at a mass-produced carrier program, akin to the US Navy's prolific Essex class, but on a smaller scale and constrained by limited resources. Design-wise, Unryū was essentially an updated repeat of the earlier Hiryu-type carrier. She measured about 746 feet in length and displaced roughly 20,000 tons at full load, making her mid-sized compared to Japan's earlier big carriers like Shokaku or the armoured Taiho. To save time and material, the Unryū-class had no heavy armour plating on their flight decks or hulls. Instead, the design prioritised speed and ease of construction. Unryū's hull and machinery were based on proven cruiser components, giving her a powerful 152,000 shaft horsepower plant. This propelled the carrier to a respectable top speed of about 34 knots, fast enough to keep up with the battle fleet. Her endurance was around 8,000 nautical miles at cruise speed, ample for Pacific operations, at least when fuel was available. The carrier's aviation facilities were designed to accommodate up to around 60 to 65 aircraft, along with a few reconnaissance planes. However, owing to Japan's mounting aircraft and pilot shortages by 1944, Unryū never embarked anything close to her full complement. In reality, she mostly carried a few dozen Zero fighters and a handful of scout planes during her brief career, a token force reflecting the scarcity of trained aircrews and aircraft in late war Japan. Unryū's defensive outfit was formidable for anti-aircraft purposes, as was typical for late war Japanese ships. She mounted 6 twin, 5-inch dual-purpose guns along the sides of her flight deck for heavy AA fire. Far more numerous were her light AA guns. Over 70 barrels of 25mm automatic cannons in triple and single mounts dotted her decks. In addition, Unryū and her sisters were fitted with 12cm 4.7-inch multi-barrel rocket launchers as a last-ditch anti-aircraft measure. These weapons reflected lessons learned under relentless American air attack, though ironically, Unryū would never face an airstrike during her service. Crucially, unlike Taiho, the Unryū-class did not have an armoured flight deck or extensive torpedo protection, sacrifices made to speed up construction. Some minor improvements were incorporated, such as additional internal bulkheads around fuel tanks and magazines, but the ships remained vulnerable to undersea damage. This vulnerability would prove fateful. Still, when Unryū was laid down on August 1, 1942, there was optimism that swift building could yield a new flotilla of carriers. Originally, 16 Unryū-class carriers were planned under wartime expansion programs. In practice, Japan's strained industry and shifting priorities meant only 3 were completed before war's end: Unryū and 2 sisters, Amagi and Katsuragi. Many others were suspended or cancelled as the tide of war turned. Unryū, launched in September 1943 and commissioned on August 6, 1944, would be the only member of her class to undertake an operational mission during the conflict. Unryū's active career was strikingly short and uneventful, a consequence of timing and Japan's dire strategic situation. Upon her commissioning in August 1944, the carrier joined the Third Fleet and spent the next few months in home waters. Initial shakedown cruises and training took place in Tokyo Bay and the sheltered Seto Inland Sea, where she could conduct flight operations away from enemy eyes. By this stage of the war, Japan was desperately short on fuel, so Unryū's movements were kept to a minimum. Her role was largely that of a reserve asset and training platform rather than a frontline strike carrier. Throughout the autumn of 1944, Unryū and her fledgling crew practiced carrier operations in relative safety. They performed takeoff and landing drills, damage control exercises, and coordinated maneuvers with other ships. However, the carrier's air group was never fully fleshed out due to the scarcity of planes and pilots. The men aboard were keenly aware that their ship was one of very few carriers left to the Imperial Navy. In late October 1944, as the Battle of Leyte Gulf raged to the south, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's carrier forces, briefly made Unryū his flagship. This was a poignant reflection of reality. Ozawa's mobile fleet had just been decimated off the Philippines, losing flagship Zuikaku and 3 light carriers, and Unryū was one of the only capital ships available to hoist his flag. For about a week, from October 30th to November 7th, 1944, the Cloud Dragon hosted the Admiral on board, even though she did not see combat during that time. By mid-November, the situation evolved again. The mobile fleet was disbanded on November 15th, 1944, as there were simply not enough operational carriers left to justify a separate carrier fleet. Unryū was reassigned alongside her newly completed sister, Amagi. In late November, the carrier loaded a small contingent of aircraft, a mix of Zero fighters and B-6N torpedo planes, presumably in preparation for future operations or defense of the homeland. These were drawn from the 601st Naval Air Group, an amalgamated carrier air wing that by this time mostly operated from land bases due to the lack of seaworthy carriers. Unryū herself remained anchored or cruising short distances in the inland sea, conserving precious fuel and awaiting orders. Through these months, Unryū had not fired a shot in anger, nor ventured beyond Japan's own waters. Yet in December 1944, as Allied forces pressed closer, the Imperial Navy decided to commit Unryū to a do-or-die mission. American troops had landed in the Philippines, on Leyte in October, and more recently on Mindoro in mid-December, and a full-scale invasion of Luzon was imminent. The Japanese High Command, determined to bolster the Philippines' faltering defense, planned an emergency reinforcement convoy. Unryū, despite her untested crew and limited air group, was assigned to carry critical reinforcements to Luzon. It was an unusual assignment for a fleet carrier, essentially using her as a fast transport. But, with few alternatives left, the Navy was willing to risk one of its last carriers in hopes of delivering much-needed aid to the front. In the pre-dawn hours of December 17th, 1944, Unryū departed Kure and steamed into the East China Sea, heading south toward the Philippine Islands. The carrier's decks and hangars were not filled with the usual complement of strike aircraft for this voyage. Instead, they were loaded with crated airplanes, spare parts, and a secret new weapon, MXY-7 Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes. 30 of these manned rocket gliders, essentially flying bombs intended for suicide attacks on Allied ships, were packed aboard Unryū for delivery to Manila. Along with them came munitions, aviation fuel, and hundreds of Army and Navy personnel bound for the Philippine front. In all, an extra load of around 1,500 tons of cargo and passengers was squeezed onto the carrier. This heavy load even saw equipment stored on parts of the flight deck, giving Unryū an unusual appearance as she set sail. It was clear that speed was of the essence. Every day counted as Allied forces tightened their grip on the Philippines. For the escort, the Imperial Navy assigned 3 destroyers, Shigure, Hinoki, and Momi, to screen Unryū during the voyage. Captain Kaname Konishi commanded the task group from Unryū's bridge. Morale on board was a mixture of determination and apprehension. Many sailors realized this mission was extremely risky. American submarines had become a lethal threat to Japanese shipping, prowling the waters from Formosa, Taiwan, to the home islands. The East China Sea, though traditionally considered near Japan's sphere, was no longer safe. Just weeks earlier, another prized new carrier, Shinano, had been sunk by a US submarine shortly after leaving port. Unryū's crew was doubtless aware of that disaster and kept vigilant watch for periscopes as they moved through the grey winter seas. 2 days into the journey, on December 19th, 1944, the task force's fears materialized. That afternoon, about 200 nautical miles southeast of Shanghai, the American submarine USS Redfish SS-395 detected Unryū's formation. Redfish had been patrolling aggressively in search of major targets, and could hardly miss the sizable silhouette of an aircraft carrier guarded by destroyers. The submarine's commander maneuvered into attack position. On board Unryū, there was little warning. The carrier's sonar and lookouts did not spot the submarine in time. At approximately 4:35 p.m., Redfish fired a spread of torpedoes at the unaware carrier. Suddenly, a shattering explosion rocked Unryū. One torpedo slammed into the starboard side forward, striking near the carrier's bow under the bridge. The detonation blew open a massive hole in the hull. In an instant, Unryū's forward boiler rooms were torn apart and flooded. The hit also severed main steam lines, robbing the ship of propulsion and electricity. Fires broke out amid the wreckage below decks, and the carrier immediately began to slow to a dead stop, listing a few degrees to starboard. Alarms rang out, and damage control parties rushed to their stations. Despite the chaos, the training and discipline of the crew took hold. They fought to keep the ship afloat, counter-flooding compartments to correct the list and attempting to isolate fires. On the bridge, Captain Konishi and his officers assessed the situation grimly. Unryū was crippled, but so far still afloat. There was hope that with quick action, they might control the flooding and perhaps even get underway again on auxiliary power, or by routing steam from remaining boilers. Meanwhile, the escorting destroyers sprang into action, commencing evasive maneuvers and beginning a desperate hunt for the attacker. The nearest moved in to drop depth charges in the vicinity, where Redfish might be lurking beneath the waves. Columns of water erupted as depth charges detonated, but they failed to find their mark. The submarine, after firing, had dived deep to evade counterattack. For a brief period, the immediate danger to Unryū seemed to have passed. The carrier's crew managed to get some steam pressure back and attempted to restart the engines to limp away. Slowly, Unryū began moving once more, leaving an oil slick in her wake. Barely 15 minutes after the first hit, Redfish struck again. The submarine, undetected, had maneuvered for a second salvo. Another torpedo sliced through the water and struck Unryū on the starboard side once more, this time near the middle of the ship, roughly under the forward aircraft elevator. This area of the ship was particularly vulnerable. It lay adjacent to the forward aviation gasoline storage tanks and directly below the hangar deck where the Oka rockets were stowed. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. The torpedo's blast ignited the volatile aviation fuel, producing a massive fireball that gouted out of the elevator well. In the same instant, a chain reaction occurred. The stored Oka warheads and explosives in the hangar detonated in a sympathetic blast. A tremendous explosion tore through Unryū's forward section, essentially blowing the bow of the ship apart. Debris, flames, and smoke burst from the carrier's shattered hull, visible for miles. Within moments, Unryū was mortally wounded. Captain Konishi, understanding the situation, gave the order to abandon ship as the list reached around 30 degrees. Crewmen scrambled to launch life rafts and dive into the cold, rough sea, fighting against time as the ship tilted more and more. In a mere 7 minutes after the second torpedo hit, Unryū succumbed. With a final metallic groan, the carrier rolled almost onto her side with a 90-degree list and slipped beneath the waves, ending Unryū's service just 4 months after it had begun. The disaster was abrupt and devastating in its toll. Hundreds of men went into the water as Unryū sank, but most would not survive. The combination of the explosions and the ship's swift plunge trapped many crew below decks. Others who escaped faced oil-slicked, frigid seas and the fading December daylight. The destroyer Shigure immediately turned to rescue survivors, despite the threat of the still roaming submarine. Shigure's crew braved the risk and plucked survivors from the water into the night. Ultimately, only 145 men from Unryū's roughly 1,400 complement were saved. That number included some of the escorting army personnel and possibly a handful of the Special Attack Unit men, but it meant that over 1,200 souls were lost with the carrier. Among those likely lost were Captain Konishi and most of the ship's officers. The tragedy of Unryū's sinking was one of the greatest single ship losses of life for the Imperial Navy in the closing months of the war. USS Redfish managed to escape despite aggressive counterattacks by the remaining destroyers. The submarine endured depth charges and even a battering from one of the escorts, suffering damage but ultimately surviving to report the kill. For the American crew of Redfish, the sinking of Unryū was a significant victory, one less carrier to face in the Pacific, but for the Japanese Navy, it was yet another bitter blow. In the immediate aftermath, Shigure and the other destroyers retreated toward friendly waters, carrying the few exhausted survivors of Unryū. Shigure arrived at Sasebo on December 22, 1944, where the rescued crewmen finally set foot on land, shaken and grief-stricken. The loss of Unryū was kept relatively quiet by the Japanese Navy. At this late stage of the war, bad news was often concealed to maintain morale. Still, within naval circles, the sinking underscored a harsh reality. In less than 2 months, Japan had lost 2 large aircraft carriers, the giant Shinano in November and now Unryū in December, to American submarines, without either ship ever engaging in combat operations. These incidents highlighted Japan's inability to safeguard even its most valuable new warships in waters that were once considered secure. Unryū's sinking left the Imperial Japanese Navy with virtually no operational fleet carriers at sea. Her sister ship Amagi was still fitting out and would be heavily damaged by US air raids before she could be used. The third completed sister, Katsuragi, never left Japanese harbours due to fuel shortages, surviving the war only to be scrapped afterward. Other smaller carriers that Japan had, such as Ryuho or converted escort carriers, were either stuck in port or used minimally. In effect, the dream of a revitalized carrier force through the Unryū-class had evaporated. For the Philippines campaign, Unryū's ill-fated final mission had no impact on slowing the Allied advance. The supplies and Oka weapons she carried went down with the ship, never reaching Luzon's defenders. By early January 1945, American forces landed on Luzon as planned, and the Japanese garrison, lacking both reinforcements and sufficient air support, continued its fight in isolation. Unryū's demise was thus part of the larger narrative of Japan's waning power in late 1944. It symbolized the twilight of Japan's carrier era, a modern warship conceived in hope but dispatched in desperation, ultimately sunk without ever launching a strike. In a broader sense, the sinking marked the end of an era for the Imperial Navy. Once, carriers like Akagi, Kaga, and Zuikaku had spearheaded offensive operations across the Pacific. Now, with Unryū's loss, almost nothing remained of that proud carrier fleet. The men who survived her sinking would continue the war in other capacities, some reassigned to infantry units or to air-based defense, as Japan prepared for the expected invasion of its home islands. Many of their comrades lay entombed with the Cloud Dragon on the ocean floor, a solemn testament to the ferocity of the Pacific War. Historically, Unryū's service was brief. From her hurried construction to her swift destruction, she exemplified the Imperial Japanese Navy's last, faltering attempts to project power in a conflict that was increasingly hopeless. Unryū never fired a gun in battle or launched an airstrike, yet her sinking stands as a significant event, the sinking of one of Japan's final fleet carriers, a ship whose first mission became her last. Unryū's fate underlines the last ultimate eclipse of Japan's naval air power, coming full circle from its meteoric rise at Pearl Harbor to its destruction and defeat less than 4 years later.